In just 3 years, one soldier expelled foreign troops, rejected the World Bank, refused the International Monetary Fund, and stood before the world to deliver a warning that silenced critics and shook the foundations of global power. His name is Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He is 37 years old. And while Venezuela burns under American airstrikes, while a sitting president is captured and flown across the ocean in chains, while threats of intervention echo from continent to continent, this young captain from a small West African nation has already written the blueprint for what resistance looks like in the 21st century. This is not just a story about one man. This is a story about dignity, about sovereignty, about the moment when the world's forgotten nations stopped asking for permission and started demanding respect. What Traoré said in the aftermath of Venezuela was not just a speech. It was a mirror held up to the powerful, a reminder that silence is ending, that patience should not be mistaken for weakness, that the era of unquestioned authority is fading, not because nations want conflict, but because they want to be treated as equals. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this story resonates, show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription. It means more than numbers. It keeps the story alive. To understand the weight of Traoré's words, you must first understand where he came from. You must understand the soil that grew this seed. You must walk the dusty roads of a small town in western Burkina Faso, where a boy was born who would one day change the map of Africa. Ibrahim Traoré came into this world on the 14th of March, 1988, in a place called Boldest. It was not a city of grand monuments or towering ambitions. It was a town of farmers and soldiers, of red earth and relentless sun, of families who worked with their hands and prayed for rain. His father was a man of two callings. By day, he served in the military. By night, he tended to the sick as a nurse. He understood both the art of war and the art of healing, and perhaps this duality would later echo in his son, a man who could fight with ferocity and build with patience. His mother was a housewife, but she was no stranger to sacrifice. She had watched her husband leave for duty too many times. She had seen what the military did to men, how it aged them before their time, how it took them away and sometimes never gave them back. She made her wishes clear to her children. Do not follow your father into the barracks. Choose a different path. Choose a safer life. But young Ibrahim had other plans. He was quiet. Teachers remember him as talented but reserved, a boy who listened more than he spoke, who observed more than he acted. He completed his primary education in Boldest, learning his letters and numbers in classrooms with cracked walls and not enough chairs. Then he moved to Boldest, the country's second-largest city, for secondary school. The streets were wider there, the buildings taller, the possibilities seemingly greater. From Boldest, he traveled to the capital. He enrolled at the University of Ouagadougou, where he chose to study geology. It was a practical choice. Burkina Faso sits atop vast reserves of gold, and geologists were needed to find it, to measure it, to pull wealth from the earth. He studied hard. He graduated with honors. His future seemed set. But something shifted during those university years, something that textbooks could not explain and professors could not teach. Traoré became involved with student organizations. He attended meetings where young people spoke about injustice, about the gap between rich and poor, about the paradox of a nation blessed with gold yet cursed with poverty. He walked through neighborhoods where children went hungry while foreign companies shipped container after container over 2 distant refineries. He saw how the system worked. He saw how the powerful took and the powerless gave. He saw how his country, rich in resources, remained one of the poorest on earth. And he began to ask why. Why did the gold leave, but the wealth never arrive? Why did foreign soldiers patrol the streets, but the terrorists keep advancing? Why did presidents change, but the suffering stay the same? These questions burned in him. They would not let him rest. After graduation, Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that broke his mother's heart. Despite her wishes, despite her warnings, despite everything she had hoped for him, he joined the Burkina Faso Armed Forces in 2009. He trained at the Georgia's Namono Military Academy. Where boys became soldiers and soldiers learned discipline, he excelled. He was sent to Morocco for specialized anti-aircraft training. Learning to read the skies and shoot down threats before they could strike, he returned home sharper, harder, more capable. Then came Mali. Traoré was deployed with the United Nations peacekeeping mission to the neighboring country. Where chaos had taken root and armed groups roamed freely, he served in the Timbuktu region, ancient city of scholars now overrun by rebels with rifles. He saw combat. He was recognized for courage under fire, for keeping his head when bullets flew and men around him fell. But he also saw something else. He saw his fellow soldiers die not because they lacked bravery, but because they lacked equipment. He watched men charge into battle with outdated weapons, with boots held together by tape, with radios that did not work. He saw politicians in the capital hand out suitcases of money to their allies, while the men on the front lines had nothing. The disillusionment grew like a tumor in his chest. By 2020, Traoré had risen to the rank of captain. He commanded an artillery regiment stationed in Kaya, a town in the volatile northern region where the insurgency burned hottest. His men respected him. They followed him. They knew he was the kind of officer who led from the front, who shared their rations and slept in their trenches, who would never ask them to do what he would not do himself. But Burkina Faso was falling apart around him. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you. To Traoré, to Burkina Faso, or simply to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality. It is recognition. It is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video. You are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and pride. So before we continue, take this pause. Comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. The jihadist insurgency that had swept in from Mali starting in 2015 was consuming. The country like fire consumes dry grass. Groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State had crossed the border and found fertile ground. They recruited from villages where young men had no jobs and no hope. They armed themselves with weapons flowing freely across porous borders. They attacked military outposts, slaughtered civilians, and seized territory. Thousands were killed. Entire villages were erased from the map. Millions of people fled their homes, becoming refugees in their own country. Crowding into camps where disease spread and food ran short, 40% of the national territory fell under insurgent control. The government, backed by France, seemed powerless to stop the bleeding, and the people were angry. They were angry at the terrorists who burned their homes. They were angry at the politicians who stole their money. And increasingly, they were angry at France, the former colonial power that had maintained military forces in Burkina Faso for years, supposedly to help fight the insurgency. Operation Sabre, Operation Barkhane. French special forces, with their helicopters and their drones and their night vision goggles, they were supposed to be the difference. They were supposed to turn the tide. But the tide kept rising against Burkina Faso. In January 2022, the anger finally boiled over. A group of military officers, fed up with civilian corruption and military failure, overthrew the elected government. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Sandogo, Damiba, seized power, promising to restore security. To defeat the insurgents, to save the nation, Traoré supported the coup. He believed in the mission. He believed that military discipline could succeed where civilian weakness had failed. He hoped this was the turning point his country needed. But within months, his faith was shattered. Damiba's government proved no different from its predecessors. The insurgency continued. Soldiers continued to die for lack of equipment and leadership. The same patterns of corruption, the same patterns of failure, the same patterns of betrayal repeated themselves. Then came September 2022. An ambush in the north. 11 soldiers killed. Dozens of civilians slaughtered. A convoy meant to deliver supplies to a besieged town wiped out on a dusty road. Ibrahim Traoré had seen enough. He rallied his men. not with speeches about personal ambition, but with words about duty, about honor, about the sacred obligation to protect those who could not protect themselves. He found allies among other young officers who shared his frustration, who had buried too many friends, who refused to accept that this was the best their country could do. On the 30th of September, 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré led a second coup. Damiba fled. The old guard crumbled, and at the age of 34, this son of a soldier and a nurse from a small town in western Burkina Faso became the youngest head of state in the world. But taking power is one thing, using it is another. Traoré inherited a nation on the brink of collapse, 2 million displaced, 40% of the territory lost, an economy in ruins, military demoralized, and standing behind every failure, casting a long shadow across the land, was France. For decades, France had maintained a presence in Burkina Faso that went far beyond military assistance. French companies controlled key industries. French currency, the CFA franc, tied the economy to Paris. French diplomats whispered in the ears of presidents. French soldiers patrolled the streets of Ouagadougou. The people had a question. It's a simple question that demanded an answer. If France is here to help us, why are we losing? Traoré asked the same question, and the answer he found changed everything. In January 2023, just 4 months after taking power, Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that sent shockwaves across the African continent and beyond. He terminated the military agreement with France. He gave the French forces 1 month to pack their equipment and leave. The reaction was immediate and fierce. French President Emmanuel Macron demanded clarification. Western newspapers called the decision reckless, dangerous, destabilizing. Analysts predicted that without French support, Burkina Faso would collapse entirely, that the terrorists would sweep into the capital within months. But Traoré did not waver. In February 2023, the last French soldiers lowered their flag and departed. 400 Special Forces personnel, gone. Operation Sabre ended. Decades of French military presence in Burkina Faso finished in a matter of weeks. And as the French convoys rolled out through the gates, something remarkable happened. Crowds lined the streets of Ouagadougou. Thousands upon thousands of people, waving flags, holding signs, cheering as the foreign soldiers departed. Some waved the green, red, and yellow of Burkina Faso. Some held portraits of Traoré. Some carried signs that read simply, "France go home." It was a moment that would be remembered for generations. A moment when a nation said, enough. A moment when the colonial hangover finally ended. But expelling France was only the beginning. Take a second, right here, to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your country, the soil beneath your feet. And as you do, know this. Rise of Africa sends you not just thanks, but a blessing. It's for strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. The comments below become a map of connection, showing that this message reaches far beyond borders. Traoré understood something that many leaders before him had failed to grasp. Independence is not just about removing foreign soldiers. It is not just about lowering one flag and raising another. True independence requires building something new. It requires breaking the chains of economic dependency. It requires creating systems that serve your own people, not distant capitals. He moved fast. He began nationalizing gold mines that had been controlled by foreign corporations for decades. He established a new state-owned mining company, putting Burkina Faso hands on Burkina Faso gold. He opened the country's first gold refinery, a facility capable of processing 150 tons of ore every year. For the first time, the gold would be refined at home, not shipped raw to European smelters. He stopped the export of unrefined gold entirely. If you want our gold, he declared, you will buy it processed. You will pay the full price. You will deal with us as partners, not as servants. The money began to flow differently. Traoré raised civil servant wages by 50%. Teachers, nurses, administrators, the people who kept the country running, finally received pay that reflected their value. He cleared domestic debts that had strangled local businesses. He invested in agriculture, distributing tractors and farm equipment to rural communities that had worked the soil by hand for generations. He launched construction projects for new roads, new infrastructure, a new airport that would connect Burkina Faso to the world on its own terms. And when the international financial institutions came calling, when the men in suits from Washington arrived with their loans and their conditions and their structural adjustment programs, Traore stood before his people and said what few African leaders have ever dared to say. Africa does not need the World Bank. Africa does not need the International Monetary Fund. We Africans have all it takes to develop our economies without foreign debt. We cannot continue to be enslaved by these debts that compound while our people starve. The words echoed across the continent. In Nigeria, in Ghana, in Kenya, in South Africa, in every nation where young people had grown up watching their governments bow to foreign weak creditors, Traore's defiance struck a chord. But he was not finished. He understood that Burkina Faso alone could not stand against the pressures that would come. He needed allies. He needed a coalition of nations willing to chart a new course together. He found them next door. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta had also expelled French forces and rejected Western interference. In Niger, General Abdurrahmane Chiani had seized power and immediately faced sanctions from the West and threats of intervention from neighboring states backed by France. Together, these three leaders formed something unprecedented. The Alliance of Sahel States, a mutual defense pact, promised that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. A declaration that the era of African nations being picked off one by one, isolated and pressured and overthrown, was over. The message was clear. We stand together now. Test us at your peril. Then Venezuela happened. And everything Ibrahim Traoré had been building, everything he had been saying, suddenly became more relevant than ever. The images spread across the world like wildfire. American warplanes streaking through Venezuelan skies, explosions lighting up the night over Caracas. A sitting president, democratically elected, captured by foreign forces and flown across the ocean to face charges in a country that had no jurisdiction over him. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who defy us. But if the powerful expected silence from the rest of the world, they miscalculated. Ibrahim Traoré watched the events unfold from Ouagadougou. He saw the bombs fall. He saw the president taken in chains. He saw the justifications offered by officials in Washington. The same justifications that had been used before in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan. The language of liberation, the rhetoric of democracy, the familiar script of intervention dressed up as salvation, and he decided to speak. Not with anger, not with threats, not with the heated rhetoric that could be dismissed as emotion. He spoke with something far more dangerous to those in power. He spoke with clarity. Africa is not shouting, Traoré declared. Africa is explaining. An explanation is often more powerful than protest. He stood before cameras and delivered words that would travel across continents. Words that would be shared millions of times. Words that would make young people from Lagos to Nairobi to Johannesburg stop and listen. What we have witnessed is not justice. It is not law. It is not order. It is a message. And the message is meant to frighten. It is meant to say that sovereignty is a privilege granted by the powerful, not a right held by all nations equally. But we reject that message. We reject the idea that some nations can bomb others without consequence, while lecturing the world about peace. We reject the idea that international law applies only to the weak. We reject the idea that our futures can be decided in rooms where we have no seat at the table. The speech did not call for war, did not threaten retaliation, did something more subversive. It named the hypocrisy plainly, without decoration, without apology. True strength, Traoré continued, is shown when you can choose dialogue over coercion, respect over intimidation, cooperation over control. Those who fail to understand this shift will misread silence as agreement and patience as weakness. That mistake has been made before. It never ends well. Within hours, the speech had been translated into dozens of languages. Within days, it had been viewed by tens of millions. In comment sections and social media threads, people who had never heard of Burkina Faso were suddenly searching for information about this young captain who dared to speak when others stayed silent. But Traoré did not stop at words. He moved through diplomatic channels with the same determination he had shown on the battlefield. Working with his allies in Mali and Niger, he brought the matter before the United Nations Security Council. The Alliance of Sahel States submitted a formal statement demanding accountability, demanding that the same rules applied to all nations, demanding that aggression be called by its proper name regardless of who committed it. Their statement was unequivocal. The use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state constitutes an act of aggression. They called on the Security Council not to look away. They demanded that the principles enshrined in the UN Charter apply equally to the permanent members of the Council. It was a bold move. Everyone knew the odds. The United States holds veto power. The chances of any condemnation passing were close to zero. The machinery of international diplomacy was designed to protect the powerful from accountability. But that was not the point. The point was to be heard. The point was to create a record. The point was to show the nations of the global South that they did not have to accept the old order in silence, that their voices mattered even when they were outvoted, that history was watching and taking notes. The point was to stand up. And on that day, in that chamber, Burkina Faso stood. On the very night that American forces struck Venezuela, something else happened. Something that received far less attention in the international press, but carried enormous significance for those who understood the patterns of history. An attempted coup against Ibrahim Traoré was reportedly thwarted in Ouagadougou. Details remained murky. Official statements were sparse. But what was clear was this. As news of the Venezuela strike spread, crowds began mobilizing in the streets of the capital. Thousands of people, ordinary citizens, poured out of their homes in the middle of the night. They surrounded government buildings. They formed human chains. They made it clear that anyone attempting to remove their president would have to go through them first. They remembered Thomas Sankara. Sankara, the revolutionary who had led Burkina Faso in the 1980s, who had renamed the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, land of upright men. Sankara, who had challenged the colonial powers and rejected foreign debt and championed African self-reliance. Sankara, who had been assassinated in 1987, shot down by his own guards in a coup that many believe was orchestrated by foreign powers. Threatened by his vision, the people of Burkina Faso had not forgotten. They had watched their hero fall. They had lived through the decades of decline that followed, the return of corruption, the return of dependency, the return of humiliation. They were determined not to let history repeat itself, and so they stood in the streets that night. Farmers and teachers and shopkeepers and students, mothers with children on their hips and grandfathers with memories of Sankara in their hearts. They stood because they believed that this time might be different. They stood because Ibrahim Traoré had given them something they had not felt in a long time. Hope. Before we close, let us pause. What you have just heard is not simply an episode of history. It is a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still alive, waiting to be claimed. If this message has moved you, then subscribe to Rise of Africa. Not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where voices of independence are honored and where stories of pride continue to be told. By subscribing, you are not just supporting a channel. You are choosing to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's unfolding story. The challenges facing Ibrahim Traoré remain immense. The jihadist insurgency has not been defeated. Armed groups still control territory in the north and east. Attacks on villages continue. Soldiers still die on dusty roads far from the capital. Millions of people remain displaced, living in camps where the future feels impossibly distant. The economy, though improving, still struggles under the weight of years of mismanagement and the disruptions of conflict. Sanctions and financial pressures from Western nations angry at the expulsion of French forces have taken their toll. and the threat of external interference, of coups backed by foreign intelligence services, of assassination attempts disguised as internal disputes hangs over Traoré every single day. He knows the history. He knows what happened to Sankara. He knows what happened to Patrice Lumumba in Congo, to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. To every African leader who challenged the established order too directly, he knows the price that is often paid for defiance. But Ibrahim Traoré has not retreated. He has not softened his message. He has not sought to appease those who would prefer his silence. Instead, he continues to build. Gold refineries process, or that once left the country raw. New roads connect villages that were isolated for generations. Schools open in communities that had never seen a classroom. Hospitals bring healthcare to regions where the nearest doctor used to be a day's journey away. A new airport takes shape, a symbol of connection to the world on Burkina Faso's own terms. He continues to speak, summits and conferences and interviews that circulate across social media, reaching millions of young Africans who see in him a different kind of leader, a leader who refuses to bow, a leader who believes that Africa can and must chart its own course, a leader who says out loud what many have only whispered. And he continues to inspire, not just within the borders of Burkina Faso, but across the entire continent. When President John Mahama was inaugurated in Ghana, heads of state from across Africa gathered to witness the ceremony. Protocol dictated polite applause for each dignitary. But when Ibrahim Traoré was announced, something different happened. The applause swelled. It grew louder and longer than for any other leader present. Young Ghanaians in the crowd began to chant his name. It was a moment that revealed something profound. Traoré's message had traveled far beyond his small landlocked nation. It had found fertile ground in the hearts of young Africans everywhere. Young people frustrated by decades of corruption, exploitation, and broken promises. They were looking for someone to believe in, and they had found him. Is Ibrahim Traoré perfect? No leader is. His government has faced criticism from human rights organizations for restricting press freedom, for cracking down on dissent, for delaying the promised transition back to civilian rule. The security situation remains dire. Questions persist about the methods used to fight the insurgency, about civilian casualties, about due process. These criticisms deserve attention. They deserve scrutiny. No leader should be above accountability, and no cause, however noble, justifies the abandonment of principle. But for millions of people in Burkina Faso and beyond, these concerns exist alongside a larger truth. For the first time in living memory, they have a leader who puts their interests first, who refuses to sell their resources to the highest foreign bidder, who speaks to the powerful not as a supplicant begging for aid, but as an equal demanding respect. That is why the streets of Ouagadougou fill with crowds when Traoré appears. That is why his speeches go viral within hours of delivery. That is why the name Ibrahim Traoré has become synonymous with a new kind of African leadership. A leadership that asks not what the world will give Africa, but what Africa will build for itself. The road ahead remains uncertain. History does not move in straight lines. There will be setbacks and reversals, moments of doubt and seasons of struggle. The forces arrayed against this vision of African sovereignty are powerful and patient. They have toppled leaders before. They will try again. But history keeps records. Today, one name has been written into that record. Not with bullets alone, but with words. Not with violence alone, but with vision. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, 37 years old. Educated as a geologist, trained as a soldier, tested in combat, forged in crisis, and still standing. When powerful nations decide to make examples out of leaders they disagree with, they believe they are sending a message about strength, but they are also sending a message about fear. They reveal that they are afraid of what happens when smaller nations stop accepting the old rules. They reveal that the current order depends not on legitimacy, but on the belief that resistance is futile. Ibrahim Traoré has shown that resistance is not futile, that dignity is possible, that sovereignty can be claimed, not merely granted, that the future does not have to be written by those who have always held the pen. He has reminded the world of something it had chosen to forget. Africa is not begging. Africa is building. Africa is not shouting. Africa is explaining. An explanation, delivered with courage and consistency, is more powerful than all the bombs in all the arsenals of all the empires that have ever risen and fallen. In the end, power is not measured only by military strength or economic size. It is measured by credibility, by consistency, by the trust that others place in your word. When actions contradict principles, credibility erodes. And once credibility is lost, influence fades. No matter how many aircraft carriers patrol the seas, no matter how many sanctions are imposed, no matter how many threats are issued, the world is watching carefully now. Not emotionally, but analytically. Nations are taking notes. Patterns are being recognized. Lessons are being learned. If global leadership wishes to remain meaningful, it must be rooted in fairness, restraint, and genuine respect for the sovereignty of all nations. Otherwise, it will slowly lose the very authority it claims to defend. This is not a threat. This is an observation. And it comes from those who have been observing for a very long time. The era of unquestioned authority is ending. Not with a single dramatic collapse, but with 1,000 small refusals. 1,000 leaders who say no. 1,000 nations who demand seats at tables where they were never welcome. 1,000 voices joining together in a chorus that grows louder with each passing year. Cooperation will still exist, but it will be negotiated, not dictated. Partnerships will still form, but they will be balanced, not exploitative. Trade will continue, but it will enrich both sides, not drain one to fill the other. This is the future that Ibrahim Traoré speaks of. This is the future that Burkina Faso is trying to build. This is the future that the Alliance of Sahel states has pledged to defend. And those who fail to understand this shift will find themselves standing alone, wondering why the world no longer listens when they speak. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, 37 years old, born in a small town in western Burkina Faso, a son of the soil, a soldier who kept his promises, leader who refused to kneel. Still standing? Remember that name? Remember Burkina Faso? Remember this moment? Because the story is not finished. The chapter is not closed. The future is still being written, and you are watching it unfold.